For those who don't know me, my name's Jonathan Knight. I currently work at RBS, and I'm going to talk a bit about how you can do the equivalent of pivot tables. So hopefully everyone knows what a pivot table in Excel is. This came about because somebody did a post on the forums about how you could do a query like a pivot table. So I wrote something up and Dave asked me to kind of come and present it. So this is the only PowerPoint slide we've got. The rest of it's we're going to look at some code and Excel and stuff like that. So I'll have to rush through or we'll be late getting coffees. Right, so like I said, we all know what a pivot table is. So for my examples, we've got a whole load of data, and a pivot table is basically it's a fancy group by kind of query, and you're just grouping by various bits of the data, and they get gradually more complicated depending on what you want to add in. So we'll start off with a really simple pivot tables and show how we do it, and gradually get more complicated. So this is about the simplest you can get. So a pivot table has rows, which is what you're kind of grouping by. So I've stolen Alex Sayovich's domain model from his book, which is this bank stuff. So the data that I had on the other tab, it's just a big list of transactions. So for this pivot, I'm just going to do transactions and total amounts. So it's a dead simple pivot. So to do that in Coherence, like I said, you're basically doing it's a group by query, and Coherence out of the box actually has a group by aggregator. So the way that you can, for a simple query like this, it isn't just a simple group by aggregator. So we've got our row, which was the account ID, so you create a POF extractor for that. We've got the aggregator, which is just going to sum up the amounts. So this is just a custom extractor for the amounts. And then we create, can't see it, create the group aggregator. So like I said, this is just bog standard Coherence. This is how you create a group aggregator. So it has a static method. You don't do new group aggregator. You just call a static one. That's what you're grouping by. That's your aggregator, and you just run it, and it not that one. Start my cache server first. God, see, it's destroyed my screen size. So I've got to start my cluster and load some data in so we can actually query it. But I suspect this QuickTime recording of the presentation is hogging my CPU. Right, so now I'll run this group extractor, and that's basically the results of that group extractor, and it's exactly the same. So it's pretty straightforward. So we can now gradually get more complicated pivot tables. So you can add more values in. So you can group by more stuff if you wanted to. If you want a count of the transactions as well and stuff like this. This is bog standard Excel really. So now we've got we've got two values, and to do that inside Coherence, we've now got in our values, we just create, I've got an array, so now we've got two values, and we just, for the aggregator, you're just using a composite aggregator that's going to run all of your value aggregators and return those results. So now you've got your rows, which is the results that come back from a group aggregator as a map, basically. So your rows are the key of the map, and then you've now got a list of values. So again, it's exactly the same as the pivot table, and you're just using bog standard group aggregator. So the next thing that you can do, you can have, in a pivot table, you can have more than one row. So now you're grouping by multiple things nested inside each other. So if I want to do it by, so I'm now grouping by the account ID, the date, same as before. So it's now, you know, we're gradually getting more and more complicated. And again, so in Coherence, like previously, like to add more rows, where we're just having multiple extractors, to do, sorry, the values, to do multiple rows, you just have more extractors for each row that you want to nest by. And then it starts to get a little bit more complicated now, because the aggregator, you basically have to, you're putting a group aggregator inside a group aggregator. So for each of the rows, you have to nest group aggregators inside each other. And then when you run it, Coherence runs each of those group aggregators inside each other, and you get basically the equivalent, you get back the equivalent of what we've just seen in Excel. So now, just like we had in Excel, we've got the account ID and its totals, and then within that we're grouping by, in this case it's the transaction type and its totals. So you can see that the data's all there exactly the same as the pivot table, but the data structure that's getting returned is gradually getting more complicated, which I'll kind of cover last. What's next? So the next kind of complication you can do on a pivot table is you can add more columns to a pivot table. So we'll add, stick currency. So our pivot table's now got much bigger, and we've now added currency in the top, and it's probably gone up here for the other currencies, but it's, you know, it's just getting more complex, and it's actually so. So adding a column is, we've still got our rows exactly the same as before, and we've still got our values, which are just normal extractors, and then we have to do columns, and columns in a pivot table again are just group bys, and it's all group bys nested in groups. So again, we just to replicate this in Coherence, we just have to, for each of our columns, we have to nest out. We're creating a composite group aggregator with the different stuff nested within it. and then we combine them all into our nested group aggregator. And then you run it and you get back an even more complicated map with maps in it and lists in it and stuff like that. But again, it's, you know, the data that you get back is exactly the same as the pivot table we just saw. And you can go on adding values, rows, columns, just like a normal pivot table, and it all comes back exactly the same. The last thing you can do with a pivot table, you can add filters to it. So you might only want to see GBP, so you can add a filter and filter on GBP. And of course, in all that is to do in Coherence. Right down at the bottom, when you execute the aggregator, I mean, that's the simple bit. You just have a filter, and it's exactly the same. It's just filtering all of that pivot table aggregation, and that's really simple to do as well. So from looking at all the different examples, as you get more and more complex, all you're really doing is you're nesting aggregators and group aggregators together for your columns and values and rows, and you can actually what you end up doing is you can just write a pretty generic method that produces the outside aggregator. And so your method just takes the rows, the columns, the values, aggregators, and then from that information works out, nests them all together, and that then just works for any. You've then got a generic method that produces any sort of pivot table query, but you still get back this really complicated maps of lists of maps and stuff like that. So you have to, when I kind of wrote it, is you just come up with a data structure to represent a pivot table, which again is fairly straightforward, because all you've got when you look at a pivot table, it's just a set of entries, and each entry has got within it the values and then its nested rows and columns. So it's just a recursive nested data structure. So once you've got that data structure to represent your pivot table, doing pivot queries is pretty straightforward. And it's all, because it's using group aggregator, it's all out of the box coherence. There's no custom code. So you could rewrite this in .NET. You could rewrite this with the C++ client. So there's no server-side Java at all for this. So it's. So you. Is it possible to apply a filter on the machine? Sorry. Is it possible to apply a filter on the machine? I mean, the having clause. I don't get what you mean.
Put a having clause to say, show me all the values greater than 10,000 on the metric.
What is that?
Just the
well, because the only filter you pass the aggregator is the first one at the start.
Yep.
So you're wanting to then filter what? Filter the results.
The results to only have a certain number. So give me the ones that are greater than 100,000.
Right. Probably not out of the box then, because this is this was written just with using out of the box Coherence group aggregators and stuff like that.
You have to post-process the result set.
Yes. Yeah. So you could. When I wrote this up and in response to the forum post and wrote it up on the blog, it was just box standard stuff. But it's, if you've got there's a data structure there that then represents your pivot table. It's just a case of adding stuff to that, presumably.
Only within here, I'm assuming your pivot results are in collection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we just need some kind of filtering collection. That as you iterate over it, it just gives you the next
Yeah.
value that satisfies the filter, right? So I would trivial to implement.
Yeah.
It's not hard. One question I kind of had as you did it is, how does this thing, scale or consume?
Yeah.
I
We
know
talked
it
about-
looks great if I'm on my cluster by myself.
We
Good.
talked about this, and it's this is the code that I've kind of shown you is this is standard coherence, and if you were going to run this for real, they're not very efficient because the way Coherence will run all of these aggregators, they're all kind of separately run across the entries, and that might not be the most efficient way. I mean, if you've got a lot of values, I mean, we've only got two on here. We've only got two values, and it's building a composite extractor that's going to run the first one, run the second one, and if you were doing something yourself, you could probably write custom extractors that would do that slightly more efficiently.
And the other one is probably you'd want to know your domain and actually toss an index or two out there.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not the most efficient, but it's more to do with it's pretty straightforward to do, and I know there's a few .NET and C++ teams out there who don't want to write any Java at all, and it's like, well, you can do all this sort of stuff with Group Aggregator, which is a class that not many people ever go in and look at or have bothered to realise that it's there, and you can actually do quite a lot with it with Group Aggregator.
Sure, it can be optimistic. The good thing, if you do have indexes on these extractors, I mean, you would avoid visualization. So many aggregators in general scale fairly well.
Yeah.
They do scale. You can actually make them run faster as you increase the size of the cluster. So,
yeah.
The only concern is it'd be interesting to see if you could figure out an indexing strategy based on the domain or likely domain that would actually make sense, so that you could actually get the index to cover the extraction and get it correct.
money amount.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be worthwhile adding the index before applying it, or would it not? Would it cost you?
Adding an index can be depending on what you're doing, can be quite a job. If you've got a cluster that's pretty full of data, adding an index it's going to either take a while, or you'll get a lot of GC, or you push your cluster over, push the node over.
Yeah, but if you have index already and it's kept up to date with insights and updates, then you can benefit from it.
And most things, you kind of know what queries you're going to do, and you're not necessarily going to let a client just fire in any old ad hoc pivot.
Well, that's what this is all about.
Actually, we might, but
well, that's what this is all about, right? It's you have a domain, you have some analyst who doesn't really know what they're looking for.
Yep.
They're dragging and dropping and slicing and dicing and saying, okay, this is what I really like. And so it is ad hoc by the very nature of the pivot table. And so, you would have to have some significant capacity to consume this if you had a lot of analysts doing it.
Yeah. And I mean, you can, of course, the other thing is you've got far more data in your Coherence cluster that you can pivot over than you can fit in an Excel spreadsheet. So it's scaled. I don't know much about Excel and writing stuff, but Coherence might scale better than an Excel spreadsheet.
Put there like a data in Excel.
Okay, well, you could try. Well, the one thing you gain out of this, if you did drop an Excel interface on it, is that you could only bring back the aggregates into Excel and then intercept the calls for drill, et cetera, and you could get a terabyte of data analyzed within Excel,
interface,
but you wouldn't actually necessarily ever see all the detail, which you never would want to anyway. So by dropping this onto Excel, you could do some really, your Excel jockeys would love you.
Yeah.
And they will kill your grid.
We'll put it in
ODs. Know that too.
Sell it to the front office.
Exactly. No support.
Yeah. Now, and so I know that was like really fast lightning kind of go through it so we don't miss T. But it was originally written up in a blog, and so if you didn't quite follow it, it's there, and you can there's bits of code there, and the examples are there, so you can go along later and look at it.
Is there an easy way to make it respond to the update?
What you mean, real-time pivot aggregator? Well, probably you would just have to listen to the underlying cache and just keep re-triggering. But I mean, we've had a few discussions about real-time aggregation, and you could probably do something for if you had a really specific case like this. You could probably build something. Doing real-time aggregators for just any old generic aggregator is quite difficult.
It's not really simple to do continuous aggregation for a well-known use case. If you just focus on solving a specific problem, it's relatively simple to do. Solving it generically is very
Or doing it efficiently as well, because if you've got a cache that's being updated a lot, you don't want to be listening to events and then doing your whole pivot every single time. So you just want to be having bits of it running in the cluster. So yes, you could do that. You could write a custom solution specifically for that, but it gets, depending on what you're using for the values, some aggregations are more difficult to do in real time than others, because you end up having, if you're just doing a count or a sum or stuff, that's fairly straightforward. If you're doing minimum and something gets deleted, well, what's the minimum now? If I've not held onto all the values, doing that more efficiently is difficult.
The other thing we ran into with this one is I had that requirement at one point where they wanted continuous real-time data in an Excel spreadsheet for pivot table use, and it was like, okay, but how do you visualize it? How do you interpret it? It's constantly changing data. It's just wiggling on the screen. You can't read it. So we couldn't even figure out how you would visualize a temporal shifting, trend-based pivot table anyway. There was no way to consume the data. So once we pointed that out to them, give us a UI, and they said, we'll get back to it. Never did. So
visualizing is one point, but monitoring and raising the layers is something
that can be done.
visualizing all you're watching is a graph. It's moving, and you can visually.
But you don't
care
need
about the exact value. You care about the trend, right?
That's not pivot table data, though.
Well, that's true.
Right? That's the difference. It was alerting is one thing, but that's a value or some query that you're monitoring. But that's not pivot table. That's not slice, dice, put it all over the place, throw out. That's different usage pattern.
Just two things. Have you tried aggregating on cross-join fields? And have you tried aggregating more?
Aggregating what, multiple fields that are in the same object in a different object in the same cache, in another cache.
In a different cache, right? So
So you're talking about joins now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do joins. The system that I work on at the moment, we've got an implementation that does joins, and you'll have to read Ben's blog at the back, Ben Stockford. That explains how we do that.
And then you do the joins and then aggregate.
You can't, but to do joins, you're relying on key association and stuff like that to know that it's all on the same node. Because if you're joining to something somewhere else, then no. But with key association and then in the aggregator, you can do stuff.
And did you try aggregating complex structures, not just numeric values? For instance, you have risk factors, and you want to aggregate your time buffers and things like that. I know because I'm working on a system that we're doing.
You can pretty much you can write an aggregator to do pretty much anything because you're writing the code. Well, no, not necessarily the group aggregator, but the aggregators that you're nesting inside that are doing your values or your rows. Those you would have to write custom aggregators for, but they're not hard to write, and it's 3.7, it's a lot easier to get hold of the backing maps of the other caches and stuff like that now than it used to be. And you can get hold of the indexes for the other backing maps and do proper queries across them now as well, so you can be a bit more efficient. So I think I managed to squeeze it in my half an hour. So do I have to stop this recording now?
Yeah.
Where is it?
Yeah, it's there. Just click.
Was it recording?
Oh, it is minimalist.
Oh, right.
Never hit record on it.
We're going to